Phil, this morning I'm asking you about our late modern environment, or at least possibly even our postmodern environment. Do you think, generally speaking, that postmodernity is a positive development for the science and religion relationship? And if so, how?
I think it's actually crucial. It's the point where nobody else gets to capture the flag. Mm-hmm. For me, as somebody who engages in the science-theology dialogue, it means that both have to come to the table as equals. The theologian doesn't get to come and say, I've got the hat of authority, I've got the book of authority, and you scientists need to bend and bow to absolute truth. It's great to have that out of religion. On the other hand, science likes to dominate. It's sort of the new religious imperialism of our day. And if from a postmodern perspective, science can't do that. It says these are the conclusions we have from certain data. Everything's tentative. If two sides come to the table with that kind of energy, you get something new, fresh, and I think much more productive.
Ideal answers indeed. Phil, with relation to science in general and cosmology in particular, what can theologians succinctly learn from a principled engagement with it or them?
Mm-hmm. The first thing is that theologians learn how to listen to the science in particular. Cosmology is a great example. Mm-hmm. Cosmology was under the control of philosophers and theologians for the entire history of the West. It was not given over to science until very recently. For example, Kant said you couldn't possibly have a scientific cosmology because it's about an infinite universe. Now that we together share the discussion of and study of cosmology, and that's the origin of the cosmos, the nature of the cosmos, we can have much more interesting insights than we ever would have had before, where one or the other side controlled. So you asked about science and cosmology, and what I like about your question is that this sharing of a domain which used to be splintered and separated is a model for the science-religion discussion overall.
Wonderful answer. I would like for you to speak a little while regarding the difference between science and religion, or science or religion.
It's interesting that in the debate, we have a lot of people saying we're engaged in constructive dialogue, but in fact, they still have the either-or mentality. We keep pushing people to a wall and say, you've got to vote. You have to take the one side or the other. That's the warfare model of science and religion, or science and theology. If we had people coming to a table pursuing a particular question and seeking to understand it, we'd have something different. Let me take an extra moment and say that during the Science and Spiritual Quest project, 7 years international, we had scientists around the table with theologians, and they sat trying to understand questions like cosmology, the nature of evolution, what does it mean to be human, as equals in a discussion. That was, for me, science and theology at its very best.
Very well. Excellent answer. In a nutshell, the future of science and religion discussion particularly, is it a positive one or a negative one? And succinctly.
I have to say, I've been a little bit more concerned in the last few years.
How so?
After 30 years of working in the discussion, I had a lot of positive responses. We made so much progress. But over the last few years, there's been a kind of splintering. I wonder if it isn't that people are beginning to fight for their own turf again. A particular kind of theologian, Reformed theologians, want to take their approach. Liberal versus conservative has become a battle. And science has been pulling back from the discussion. So part of what I hope for the volume that you've put together is it can bring people back into dialogue again with the belief that we really can make progress in these questions.
In a nutshell, is the future of the science and religion discussion projected to be a positive one in your summation, or do you expect it to be a negative relationship?
In the long term, there has to be that discussion, or, let's be honest, religion gets marginalized. Science won't be pulling back. It's not that we can imagine in 200 years we'll have a human race and science will be on the corner. The tug toward a secular worldview, a naturalist worldview, will go stronger and stronger as the cultural power of science increases. Religion can refuse to engage and be marginalized, a sort of fundamentalism that a few backward-minded people engage in. Or religion can engage with sciences, not fight scientists on fundamental questions, and be involved in a rich, important, and credible discussion. The trouble in the science-religion discussion today is there's a sort of bad faith on both sides. We know it traditionally from religious people who say these scientists are God-hating secularists who want to destroy our faith, destroy the fundamental beliefs. And the trouble with that is it's not true. There are a few scientists who are dogmatic and pushing back against religion, like the new atheists people are aware of, but it's not true overall. To be fair, we have to say that a number of the scientists will do the same thing, act in bad faith. And I do think that that is the problem with the new atheists. Dawkins says there is nothing in religion that's helpful, except a few studies where it can improve our overall health and metabolism. Christopher Hitchens said that religious people are out to destroy us, and that religious people are nothing better than a brothel keeper or an ethnic cleanser. So my little Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Ballantyne, is as bad as an ethnic cleanser. That kind of attitude shuts down any dialogue and creates more hatred on both sides. We don't have to take that kind of posturing. We can approach each other with good faith and see whether we can make some progress.
In part 2, Science, Faith, and God, you discuss doubt in 2 essays. Doubt. Christian doubt, presumably. It's my contention that most people in the world today, at some point in their lives, they're going to have trouble with family or something to that extent, and they're going to go through a period of respectful doubt. How do you deal with the biblical writ that gives examples of people who doubted and then they were castigated for that?
It's an interesting question. We have said in the faith traditions, in Christianity anyway, that doubt is a sin. And we have certain scriptures that we bring out. Can I just point out that the people who live their lives after Hebrew Bible, Christians call it Old Testament, think that doubt is an intrinsic part. It's your action, your observance that counts, and doubting even the existence of God isn't a difficulty. I think they've grasped something of the biblical view that Christians have lost. We've lost it not because of the biblical texts, but rather through the creeds. Constantine enforced the creed by killing those who wouldn't sign it. If we go back to the scriptural texts, for example, we have somebody say, help thou my unbelief. So I want to believe, but I can't. Even though there's a confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord component, that's Paul, but it occurs elsewhere, there are many other passages where people get to explore and think. The doubting cannot be called a sin. We're not required to in the Christian tradition, and we will kill the church for younger people, millennials and Gen Z, if we don't give the space for people to bring their real human questions, their adult doubts, and interact with those and dialogue about them in churches, university classrooms, and so forth.
In the third part of our book, we cover panentheistic reflections on science and theology. When I was first putting this book together, I wanted to put panentheistic reflections on science and theology at the forefront of the volume in part 1, and then have everything sort of decline from that, or be a declension from that. Whereas people that I spoke with to get advice about this told me that I should place the science and religion discussion section up toward the front. I somewhat regret not putting panentheism at the front of the book, because I do believe it to be true that panentheism is your clarion call, at least the basis of what you work with. Would you agree with that?
That's complicated. There's a sense in which they work together as a spiral. I came into the science-religion debate and I couldn't make sense of divine action, of miracles. Even as an undergraduate, I couldn't fit those two pieces together. And as I struggled with that was this early book, God in Contemporary Physics. I came around to begin to study this movement called Panentheism. It's a much more recent position, 200 years, that speaks of the world as being contained within God, but God is also more than the world. Once it's opened up in the last few hundred years in the West, then you can begin to see how that was a position in the New Testament. Think, for example, in whom we live and move and have our being in Acts 17, Paul and Areopagus. So I then began to see that you could take that position of a God who permeated the world at every moment and use that as a way of understanding how God could be effective in the world. So that allowed me to come back to the science of religion discussion, divine action, and then more subtly to understand how God permeates the world. That's a theological task. And then come back to rethink. So you're right, that's actually one of the strongest dynamics for me. That panentheism has grown deeper in my own thinking, but so has the sense of how we can speak of God's action in response.
Wonderful. In the fourth section of our book, Phil, that is Science and Emergence, we cover what is in many senses what most people, the very heart of the book, what most people think of when they think of Philip Clayton and what most people think of when they think of emergence to be Philip Clayton, etc. Those two go hand in hand. But it's been over a decade since you published anything on emergence. I believe it was your last title was the Reemergence of Emergence with Paul Davies, co-edited with Paul Davies. And then, of course, your singular text, Mind and Emergence, the earth-shattering text that truly rocked my entire intellectual world. Regardless, that was 2004. In the intervening 14 years, thereabout, have there been any critiques of your critics to change your mind on some of the assertions therein?
That's a fascinating question. First, I have to point out that you included in the collection emergence pieces from 3 other volumes. So Adventures in the Spirit had a whole section on emergence. The Freedom book, In Quest of Freedom, was really about the emergence of human thought, consciousness, morality, and freedom. Okay. Then when I did the book with Steve Knapp, The Predicament of Belief, Science, Philosophy, Faith, that one was really all about emergence too. That's how we came to the questions like resurrection, God's activity in the world, and so forth. So it wouldn't be true to say I've backed away. I've probably published 40 essays on the topic since 2004. And no, how has the discussion changed when we talk about emergence in religion? I would say that we have now broadened out from what was a very generic topic. What is emergence? What is theology? How they fit together? It's gotten, like any good research program, much more concrete. Let's talk about emergent complexity in the early parts of biological evolution. Let's talk about animals who form a theory of other minds and awareness. Let's talk about the emergence of culture in higher primates. Each of these is a specialized area of study. So in a sense, we pull back from that big term in order to show its power in a variety of different areas. You've asked me before about the kinds of criticisms that have been raised and where emergence is most vulnerable. I wanted to mention 3 of those and hint to you, even if I don't have time to describe it, how there are powerful answers to each objection. I'll go from my position downward. The next one is called weak emergence. Base level physical systems create more complicated things, so it's still emergence, but all the causes and the explanations eventually have to go down to physics. That would be devastating for my position and the way that other theologians are using it, but this is a criticism that's often raised. I don't think the science requires us to give up on causation of a human being or a porcupine or an amoeba. We can have them as really emergent causal agents, which is what I argue for. A second area of criticism is naturalism. And it says, great, Phil, it's nice that you can follow this process of evolution up to humans and their thoughts. But as soon as humans start thinking about God, then there is no longer anything that can be said that's reasonable. I completely disagree with that limitation on the discussion. Then finally, there are those who use emergence as a hidden form of dualism. I won't mention their names right now, but Hackett has written that we move to the emergence of mind, and when mind arrives, soul has emerged. So emergence plus Thomism. And that's a view that I don't think actually works. So those are criticisms you bump into. I think there are strong answers to each one.
I would like to follow up with you quickly regarding your position on weak emergence. You said in your answer that that's not really a defensible assertion or a position that's defensible per se. How would you respond then to someone who tells you that strong emergence is illogical or even perhaps indefensible?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Let me respond by describing how I would approach that question in writing, how I actually do in our volume, which is to try to make their position as strong as possible and to admit the weaknesses of my position. If we could actually do that in the science-religion debate, we would have far more interesting and productive discussion. Weak emergence is powerful because, of course, that's what science looks for. You want to take some level of behaviors and reduce them downward to a lower level explanatory framework. Science is brilliant at that. General relativity, special relativity, Newton's laws bring together different spheres of experience into one. And strong emergence makes a claim that may be hard for scientists to follow up on, which is that you have a being who is its own source of causation, who is its own agent, and not reducible to the lower levels. However, I think both criticisms are unfair. Science doesn't need to say that, for example, when a biological system evolves in a certain way, that's just complicated physics. In fact, we can show that in biology there's a different kind of thing altogether happening. On the other hand, we can admit that agents grow more complex across biological evolution. You don't need to have a faith commitment to hold that. You don't need to have a metaphysic to hold that. The empirical evidence is powerful. In fact, in science de facto, you take a given level of phenomena, right? The way that culture impacts human digestion, right? For example, and you study it at the level of what the humans are learning on farms, what their values are. In fact, we explain using causal frameworks at that particular level. So why would somebody suddenly say, oh, you can't do that? You only explain if you go downward. Bradford, you ask about interdisciplinary dialogue and whether that really fits with a highly disciplined nature of the sciences. And I want to say an emphatic yes. We came from a period, let me just take Jane Goodall as an example, where there was a young man from Cambridge sitting on a hill looking at chimpanzees 100 yards away and giving each one a number and saying 43 just hit 25. Well, in a sense, that was excellent science. It was quantitative. He would measure the degree of angle as they stood. Jane Goodall came along. She moved down the hill. When they accepted her, she sat in the middle of the chimpanzees, accepted. She gave them names, famously, graybeard and so forth, and brought more knowledge than we'd had before. The same thing happens, for example, in the study of mind-brain relations. Have you seen the picture of the monk who sits there with electrodes all around his head? He engages in compassion meditation, something he's done for 10,000 hours of practice. And the scientists learned something about the brain they didn't know before. I guess where this points is that we live in an age, an exciting age, where science can now ask the broader questions. I studied the neuronal pathways, but I asked the question, what does it mean to be human? I studied pigments in cave paintings from 100,000 years ago, and I asked the question, who were these human beings or these Neanderthals who did this painting? What might they have been trying to project, to say? Do you see how those were questions that were excluded in a past, call it a modernist or discipline-controlled discussion, but now are encouraged in this new phase of scientific study? And for me as a religion science scholar, nothing could be more exciting.
That's a follow-up question to that, to what you've just given to me. Do you think in the last 14 years anything has given more weight to your strong emergence position versus the opposing weak emergence?
Definitely. Okay. I'll make a strong statement. I think that weak emergence as a research program has not progressed. In fact, I'll say that it is in some ways a metaphysical commitment on the part of reductionist science. By contrast, look at what has happened empirically over these last years. I think the growth of systems biology has been a game changer. Because when you study a system, you study it here at a middle level. You ask about the causal forces that made it that way, but you also ask about the constraints of higher level systems. That's exactly strong emergence in the middle of the biggest growth area in biology today. The study of agents across the biosphere has been huge. Have you seen these films of dogs and wolves doing play behavior where they find the variations of a given agent, so let's say a given wolf, that are not programmed by genes? Finally, the biggest one of all is epigenetics. We have found that the environment of the cell, or the intercellular environment, has a huge effect on which genes are expressed. In fact, the most radical one is called transposons, where you go down to the gene, a protein is asking for information, and the order of the DNA rungs is actually changed to produce a different protein, which will do something different in the cell. These are strong emergent phenomena that can't be taken downward in a bottom-up framework.
Now, I have written, in response to your several texts regarding emergence, that I've defended a weak emergence position. How would you respond, knowing that that one of your students has taken a different perspective and argued for weak emergence over strong emergence? How would you approach refuting such an idea?
Oh, he loses his scholarship. That's obvious. No, seriously, I am actually more interested in the criticisms than those who come along and say, "Oh, of course I push for your position." In fact, what intrigues me about the book you've put together is it asks for criticism. As it's used in classrooms, it's used more broadly. People say, here are the bold claims that Clayton made. Do they really stand up? And I'm hoping to do a number of conferences and other speaking engagements where the room will be filled with critics. What I'll get out of that is further growth. So if you have this criticism and this student, I want you together in a discussion group or in one of my large classes, raising criticisms, make me sweat, and make me think in a more clear and convincing way what my position is, or change my position. You ask about fallibility. Can we do work when we're not sure of the outcomes? And you say, well, sure, in science, every theory is fallible. Everyone is out there and we try to falsify it. Can you imagine what it would be like if in our field, or theologians more generally, we put out theories and did our best to falsify them? In other words, take that scientific way of thinking and bring it into the heart of theology. How would theology look different? When you ask me about the underlying motivations of my work, I would say that's actually it. I've always dreamed of a theology that could be fallibilist. It's a part of the life of people who believe deeply, whose lives are molded by discipleship to Jesus, and yet who are able to ask the fundamental questions about their beliefs, to probe for input from Jews and Muslims and Buddhists, and then to see how they want to keep evolving their beliefs. Remember the Reformation expression, always reformed, always reforming. We can do that as theologians if we have the will to do so.
Phil, in many ways, your entire writing corpus is a quest for palatable divine action. How would you respond to a scientist who believes that divine action through reductionism?
That's actually a really serious question, and it's one I've struggled with for a long time. I've learned that the religious person has to pull back his or her claims, has to be more modest in what we say. It means taking on natural theology. We can't begin any longer to claim that we're going to move from something in science to prove divine action. That's a huge step in humility. Instead, we need to be satisfied with finding the way that one could possibly speak of divine action if he or she wants to do that. In other words, I'm looking for openings within the natural world. If the scientist sees that, I'm not going to take his conclusions and pop God out of a hat. Then an open discussion can take place. People will sometimes say, look, there is no reason to affirm divine action here. Why would one want to? And then we can say, if you have a worldview where there is a broader purpose or meaning or direction in evolution, then we can think that as a form of theistic evolution without in any way getting in trouble with the science. That would be my core position.
Well, in view of your response there on divine action, how would you defend the resurrection in the 21st century today?
Of all the conclusions I've come to, that's probably the most difficult for me and probably the most painful. I worked for years as a student of Panenberg, trying to find a way to prove an empty tomb consistent with science. He did this. I could not follow it. The arguments don't hold. There are many people like Josh McDowell who've tried to bring data to support it. Gary Habermas who's tried to make the case. Those arguments just don't hold up. I had hoped that as a scholar I could make that case in a way that the scientists would say, okay, that's possible. The truth is, one can't make that case. You can't rip apart the fabric of the causal world, of the natural world, and have a God step in and bring cells back to life, billions and billions of cells which have turned into mush, and billions of miracles in order that Jesus' body, the physical body, begins to walk around again. Yet, empty tomb is a strong part of the Christian proclamation. That the good news is that that's not all the Christian proclamation. The body transformed from a spiritual body to a spiritual body from a physical body is also part of the biblical account. The ophthe, the I see, can be not just I see a physical body, but I realize inside myself. So when I found myself forced to affirm a spiritual resurrection, but not a resurrection of the body with a physical miracle involved, I feel that I found a position that both works for the scientists, but also works for a self-understanding of the Christian tradition in the 21st century.
In view of that last question, how do you respond to biblical literalists who, for example, emphasize and even insist on a literal resurrection and a literal empty tomb, etc.?
No question you could ask could be more important in that one. We have left religion to wander on its own, to follow its own lead with no kind of constraint, as if to be religious is to be able to set the standards of truth and knowledge. It's just not true. Religion has always been a part of a broader culture, always in dialogue with what people believed about the natural world. The most important contribution of the science and religion dialogue is for scientists to say it just doesn't go like that. If you want to say that part of biblical literalism, of course you can do it, but now you stand in opposition to the entire edifice of science that built your cell phone, your house, your car. If that science were false, none of this would work. Therefore, you can marginalize yourself, put yourself outside of the normal standards of knowledge, or you can engage in dialogue between your scriptural text and your science. If when I'm dead, one part remains, if anything, people are reading this volume on Clayton that you put together 50 years from now, I want them to say biblical literalism clashed with science and biblical literalism gave way.